So we come to Act 4 now. For the start of Act 4, in fact, we're going to look at the first 50 lines of Act 4, Scene 1 in King Lear, thinking about HUA, English Literature, A-Level, Paper 1. We're going to think about where we can locate this passage in the whole play, what's the narrative, what can we say about the characters, the themes, the language and the structure, what about the performance of this sequence, does it link to tragedy in general? So, Act 4, Scene 1, in terms of locating the scene, what we can see is that obviously this comes out, it's the sort of calm after the storm. It feels like it's the sort of next day after the literal storm, and then the madness of Lear and then the horror of Gloucester's blinding, and it will be immediately after that. Although remember, at the end of Act 3, there's a little sort of almost moment of quiet where the servants talk about what they've seen in a sense of shock. It's possible there might be an interval in modern productions around this point. So there's a sense of a certain fresh airness, really, that you get after a storm. The air's been cleared, and for a moment it seems like maybe the play's now going to take a more upward trajectory, and we're going to have some rising action, because we can't really have located, if we're thinking about tragedy, any rising action so far in the play, except for the bad characters, the evil characters. They've risen. All the even slightly morally good characters seem to have fallen. It looks likely that the fool has disappeared from the play, probably to commit suicide. Kent is following Lear in a sense of desperation. Lear is delusionally insane. Gloucester's lost his eyes. Edgar's still wandering around in the form of some kind of mentally ill tramp. Nothing really is going very well, and for anybody. Cordelia's just off stage. We've heard her mentioned, but she hasn't appeared. She will return in this act. So this particular scene sees a simple act of Edgar being asked or being sort of positioned to help Gloucester towards Dover. Of course, the people who ask him to do that have no idea that he is in fact Gloucester's son. And we'll see this kind of throughout Act 4, this strange thing of Edgar not revealing that he is Gloucester's son, even though you would think at this point there's no harm in him doing so. You can see how broken and defeated his father is, although I don't suppose he knows the full facts of what's happened, and he doesn't know what Edmund's been up to exactly. So I suppose you could say he's still in a state of confusion and uncertainty. He's also in a state of shock, both at what he's seen in the behaviour of King Lear on the heath, and now at the state of his father in this horrifically broken state. So for whatever reason, he doesn't reveal who he is, and you have this strange tension of him interacting with Gloucester, but Gloucester not realising that it's his son. However, beginning the scene, Edgar's pretty cheerful, and this is the weird upbeatness of Edgar, really, He says, it's better to know that you're condemned, broken, low, unwanted, than to be still condemned and flattered. In other words, there's this thing that appears a lot in Shakespeare, seems to be a concern for Elizabethan and Jacobean audiences, that in the court and in the high society, it's all flattery and all lies, and you get told how marvellous you are, but behind your back, everybody's gossiping and bad-mouthing you. And so this is another mention of that it's better off to know how low you are rather than to think you're doing well when you're not. And in fact, people have got it in for you, but are not revealing that. And he goes forward from that. And again, this sort of optimistic view, to be worst, lowest, dejected. And again, notice the harsh, bitter language which is throughout the play. There's so much language of despair and defeat and violence. But he says it stands still in Esperance. Esperance says it means hope. So he says, it's pretty good because he's so low that at least you've got hope of improving, the only way is up, that kind of cliche. And I don't live in fear because it can't get any worse. It seems to be his implication there. And he says the really bad change is when you go from the best to the worst. The worst returns to laughter. So when you're at your bottom, the only way is up. So you're going to eventually go back to a better life, a happy life. It's the Wheel of Fortune image that was used at the end of Act 2, Scene 2 for Ken, when he felt he was at his lowest. You think, oh, fortune's wheel will turn and things will improve. And then he says, welcome then, thou insubstantial air that I embrace. So that does have that clear-aired breath of fresh air feel about it. Everything's on the way up. And again, there's this idea of nature's not to blame, and this relationship with nature that Lear investigated. I don't blame the wind for blowing at me, and he doesn't blame the storm for storming. So, this strange bit of cheerfulness from Edgar here, which, of course, in the nature of this play is then immediately structurally contrasted with the image of Gloucester being led, clearly blind, and Edgar immediately has to respond with a sort of empty cry of world, world, oh world, which is a way for Shakespeare to give the actor a chance just to moan and groan and just be despairing, really. Oh, what a world is it that we live in that this should happen. Now, there seems to be a misprint on this internet copy, or at least most versions say that last line in Edgar's first speech is life would not yield to age. And what it seems to say is that you wouldn't put up with getting old. You'd kill yourself if it wasn't you'd be desperate about age, and you'd be desperate about dying, I suppose, more, if it wasn't for the fact that life is constantly making us hate it anyway. So when you do get to be old, you don't really care if you die or not. I think that's what he's saying there. So from that hopeful speech to a bleak, very, very bleak speech. Gloucester goes through this whole act now, going up and down in his mood, from absolute despair to being convinced at some point to have some sort of hope. And here he's in total despair. He says to the man who's trying to help him, who says, I've been your tenant all these years. And he says, get away from me. You can't do me any good, and you might harm yourself. So, there's interesting there that Gloucester shows compassion and sympathy, and he seems to have had that within him all along. He's just been fooled into mistreating Edgar. He's not as blatantly unkind as Lear would be, perhaps, at times. So he wants to, and again, it's this idea of sympathy for others that seems to be cropping up more and more, that all of them have had to learn, the way that Lear showed the fool into the hovel before himself and asked whether he was cold or not. And now here Gloucester's saying, well, no, I don't want my loyal followers to follow me because it might harm them. The old man, again, showing the sort of lower class characters are the ones who have sympathy more than any. How are you going to find your way without any help? And he has these wonderful sort of resonant speeches now, Gloucester. I have no way and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw. So I've got nowhere to go. I've got no future. This sort of bleak image. And then I stumbled when I saw is absolutely true, isn't it? He realises now that when he could physically see, he didn't see what was going on. And so he says out loud, oh dear Edgar, the food of thy abused father's wrath, might I live but to see thee in my touch, I'd say I'd eyes again. So, I feel like I wasn't blind again if I could just touch Edgar and hold him and know that he was there. Now, presumably Edgar hears this, and so this is the thing, well, okay, why not just step forward and say, well, here I am, Dad, let's reunite and at least cheer each other up a bit. But he doesn't, and he never particularly says why he doesn't. It may be a convenience of the play, and these things that we have to accept, that any form of great art is not necessarily judged by the standard of would it really happen in real life, because we're trying to say something that's expressive and bold and has resonance beyond just a depiction of life as it actually is. It compresses things, does art anyway, whatever it does, and can't replicate the boring pace of real life. However, Edgar doesn't speak up. Perhaps he doesn't quite hear Gloucester say that is possible, and that might be one way of avoiding the slight confusion as to why he doesn't. But the old man spots Edgar, and Edgar now has an aside, and again sharing things with us, which should be building a relationship between us and Edgar, but I'm not sure if it quite does. But he says, who can say I am the worst ever, because there's always going to be more terrible things to come. And he picks up that after the old man says it's Mad Tom. The worst I may be yet, the worst is not so long as I can say this is the worst. So it's that idea that if you've got enough kind of sense and enough wherewithal to be able to speak and to recognise that things are bad, then you can't be that bad. There's always more to come, and there's always worse to come. And so this seems to be, from that optimism of the beginning of the scene, there's a real contrast now to this incredible pessimism that you'll never be able to say this is the worst, because there'll always be worse to come. You can always fall further. So there's this sort of confusion. Gloucester, is it about who is it? He doesn't quite get it. And then says, well, he must have some reason, or he couldn't beg. And he remembers he says, I saw somebody last night who looked like that, which made me think a man a worm. Wonderful, vigorous, powerful, depressing language there, another animal. But that is really what the play has done to a lot of the characters, isn't it? Reduced a human being to the status of a worm, to a nothing, to a crawling thing upon the ground. So he remembers seeing Edgar, although he didn't recognise him as his own son. And then he comes up with one of the great quotable quotes from the play. As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. So we, human beings, are treated by the gods the way that little boys treat flies, pulling their wings off and tormenting them. That seems to be his vision now at the moment. He's been calling for the gods for quite a bit through the play, and now that things have got so bad, he seems to think, well, the gods actually actively like to torment us. They get pleasure in seeing our pain, which is, again, one of the bleakest views of the metaphysical world that's possible. But it is borne out by some of the beliefs of the Romans and Greeks, when this play is actually set in their era, really, because often the Greek gods, for instance, in the great poems by Homer, are deliberately difficult in their behaviour towards human beings. They deliberately make their lives difficult, often to get back at each other, because one god supports Odysseus, so another god will deliberately thwart him in order to get back at the other god. So there's this view here of the gods as being just horrible human beings, really, on a grand scale, who have magical powers, and they will inflict the most horrible things on us for sheer sadism, really. So there's Edgar, and he sort of again talks to himself and says about playing the fool to sorrow, which is kind of what he was doing last night. But he's not sure what to do here, I suppose. What's his best move? How do I cope with my father's sorrow? And for some reason, he takes on board that, having hit his own moment of pessimism, he takes on board the idea that it's his job to cheer his father up. So Gloucester again calls him the naked fellow, just really Shakespeare emphasising Edgar is the man himself, the thing himself, as unaccommodated man that Lear called him. So Shakespeare wants us all the time to see this totally wrecked vision of humankind as being the essence of human experience. So Gloucester says, okay, to the old man, you can go, and I'll just use this guy to help me to get to Dover, where at least he can hopefully find some people who support him. He thinks that Cordelia might be already there. The old man believes that Edgar is genuinely mad, and then of course Gloucester has another one of his little quotable quotes. He says, "'Tis the time's plague when the madmen lead the blind." In other words, it's an image of how bad things are. We are kind of like a symbol of the horrors of our existence, that madmen leading the blind is the poster of our era, if you like. It's the symbol, it's the meme that of all memes. It stands for what we are today. And that seems to be where the play's got to, a very bleak vision of the world in which madmen lead blind men. Nobody is capable of acting with any sense or any awareness. The old man, like many of the characters in the play, remains faithful. You've seen this with other servants, you've seen it, of course, with Kent. This tremendous faith and loyalty, and he says, "I'll get some clothes for him to wear," which is part of the process of Edgar recovering his sense of self, that he's going to be allowed to put some clothes on him. And so he's not going to be wandering around as this symbol of naked, unaccommodated man any longer. But at this point, we think there's a fluctuation between pessimism and some sort of optimism, but it's pretty pessimistic overall. Things have fallen very low, and Edgar, now leading Gloucester towards Dover, doesn't seem to have much purpose or future to it, really. And of course, we'll see later, that, and not much later, that what Gloucester actually wants is to be led to Dover so he can throw himself off the cliffs of Dover. So Gloucester is probably determined that he needs to end his life, but in his state might find that physically quite awkward, and he thinks that's an easy way to do it. So this is the sort of bleak heart of the play, and it doesn't get much more cheerful really anywhere in the play, but certainly not until briefly at the end of this act. We might see a little uptick when Lear is reunited with his daughter. But at this stage, we just think Edgar's optimism at the beginning of this scene is absurd. We knew it was when he said it, and now he knows it too. And in terms of the tragedy, it's saying that the world is tragic, and it just goes from one bad thing to another, and one bad tragic mistake leads to more and more terrible events. And so again, this bleak view of human existence, but you don't need to scroll through the news to realise it's not necessarily an unrealistic one.